So, for this third class, we're going to be talking about poverty and inequality. Um, for this lecture, I'm going to focus much more on the poverty side of things and then a little discussion of inequality at the end. But also, this lecture is going to focus much more on inequality and poverty within a country, and then next lecture will focus on kind of the global inequality case. So, moving right along, just to give you an idea where we're going, we're going to start with poverty, talk about some theories of poverty, types of poverty, and if poverty is natural. In there, we'll talk about kind of poverty in both a U.S. context and a global context. And then for the last little bit of this lecture, we'll talk about inequality, kind of the justification for inequality in a market society, how we measure it, and how inequality changes over time within a country. So let's kind of start by talking about why we care. Why do we care about poverty? And a large part of it is just a moral imperative that we think people should have things they need to support a reasonable human existence. And so that's kind of just like a pure, innate, in and of itself argument of why we should try to eliminate poverty. But there are other kind of more self-interested arguments as well. For instance, societies that have extreme poverty also experience great social disruptions. And a closely related concept to that is the concept of collective costs, in that when people are poor and can't take good care of themselves, that imposes certain collective costs on society. And yes, in the kind of simplest way of thinking about it, that's you could think of that as like welfare payments. But more broadly, it also imposes collective costs in that, well, poor people are less healthy, and so less healthy people are less productive, and so society is worse overall because poor people are in this kind of spot that makes them less able to contribute to society. Now, there's a few different ways to think about poverty, and this is a non-exhaustive list, but I just wanted to go through a few different ways of thinking about poverty. One is the classical way, and so this would be people like Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, your classical political economists. And their idea is that there's this culture of poverty that perpetuates people making bad decisions, and so it's a very individual concept of poverty. But even within this highly individualized concept of poverty, the state should intervene to change people's attitudes and capabilities. In other words, we want to make people more capable of not making bad choices. And so this is why thinkers like Smith and Mill were huge proponents of public education. And so this is kind of one way of thinking about it, and kind of the oldest within the economics profession. More neoclassical, so a kind of evolution of the classical position, is that people are poor because they are less productive. Because neoclassical economists believe that people in labor markets are paid according to their productivity. So the reason why people are may be less productive is because they lack certain endowments like human or social capital. So they lack skills, training, experience, or they lack social connections that would allow them access to higher paying jobs. And the policy prescription that follows from that is the state should incentivize people to be more productive, and the state should subsidize human and social capital development. Once again, public education falls into that. And so this is kind of a more traditional way of thinking about poverty. A Keynesian position places poverty in the context of a macroeconomy. So people are poor because the economy is not running efficiently. Poverty is a lack of income, and public provision of capital goods helps make the economy run more efficiently and promotes equality. And so the idea here is that if you've got kind of your production possibilities frontier for an economy, if we're not on the frontier of that curve, then that means that we are kind of leaving productivity on the table. And so if we could just have public provision of capital to put a bunch more people back to work, then we will help to alleviate poverty. And in this position, economic growth or increasing output is favored over redistribution generally. Once you are closer to potential output, then there are more arguments from the Keynesian position that favor redistribution. And finally, the Marxian position would put forward that people are poor because they belong to an exploited class. Poverty is a social phenomenon, it's relative, and it's related to class. So, in other words, people are poor because they're workers and not capitalists, right? And so the prescription that would follow from this is workers advocating on behalf of themselves through unions for regulation, reform, and ultimately a dissolution of class, which is the basis of inequality in this kind of more functional theory of poverty. So these are kind of all different theories of poverty that come to us from various different schools of thought in economics. But there's also a more broad idea that a broad idea of poverty that is often used by sociologists, and this is the social exclusion theory of poverty. And the idea is that people are poor because they lack social networks and social capital, and this creates a vicious cycle that perpetuates poverty. So in other words, if you lack social capital, then it's also likely that your children will lack social capital, right? Because you're just not running in circles of people that have access to more kind of remunerative employment. So poverty is multidimensional in this. The idea is that people seek autonomy, freedom, status, political influence, fairness, justice, dignity, and community. In other words, to be fully participatory citizens in their society, both economically and politically. And so poverty is more than just a simple lack of income. It's this multidimensional social principle. And in this way, it kind of echoes the Marxian perspective to an extent, but it also has in there kind of the neoclassical perspective and the classical perspective, and that the emphasis is on these like social networks. And so in this view, poverty is more a process than a state of existence, and it's a process that has to be interrupted by intervening in important domains. So in other words, you look at poverty, you see that, poor people are not getting education. Maybe we should increase funding for schools in neighborhoods with lower incomes, right? So this kind of idea of specific interventions based on different domains in which people are poor. In a more global context, one example might be that women and girls are often burdened with the responsibility of carrying water. And so a specific intervention in that context might be less, we should build a school right away, and more, we need to build pipes so that girls are less burdened by this unpaid household labor, so that then they will be able to attend school when it is built, right? And so it's this idea that we should kind of look at the lives of poor people and see what processes are interrupting the formation of social networks and social capital that could help prevent the cycle of poverty. So related to these theories of poverty are two concepts of poverty. And so one is absolute poverty. And so this is a lack of income necessary to meet the most basic human needs. So these are just the income necessary to provide food, water, clothing, shelter for yourself. This is the idea of biological subsistence, right? And so some people that experience absolute poverty are in very real threat of, dying, right? And so this is the idea of absolute poverty. Relative poverty is a little less well defined. It's not based in this biological reality, but in social reality. In each society, there's a certain level of income consistent with decency. So it's not just biological necessities, but other amenities too. And so I would invite you to think about the society in which you're from. what are some things that are not biological necessities that are probably social necessities? In my experience, in the U.S., and many of you probably shared the same experience, life without a cell phone today would be a way of lacking social subsistence, right? Because you need some form of telecommunications device to find employment and maintain social connections. And so that would fall under more closely to this idea of relative poverty than an idea of absolute poverty. So we can also think about poverty in a more multidimensional way. And so we can think of it less in terms of a lack of income necessary for biological or social subsistence, and think of it more as lack of access to goods and services necessary for human life. So it could be education, could be healthcare, could be food. And so multidimensional poverty kind of lumps in together a relative and an absolute poverty idea. So something to also keep in mind is that in any society, people grow into and out of poverty as they age. So people tend to be poorer when they're younger and poorer when they're older, and better well off in middle age. But in every society, the degree in which people are able to move between these being impoverished and not impoverished through their life cycle is different. And so within every society, some people get stuck and they are considered chronically impoverished. So, to give you some context to all of this, in the U.S., the poverty rate in 2017 was 12.3%. The current poverty line for a single person under 65 is $11,770 a year, $24,250 a year for a family of 4 with 2 children. So, and we already talked about this a bit in the measurement class of how those things are defined, but a full 12.3% in the U.S. live in poverty. And so these rates can't, and once again, harkening back to what I spoke about in the previous class, poverty lines are defined differently in different countries, so these rates are not easily comparable between nations. Pivoting to a more global case, the international poverty line is $1.25 a day. 1.4 billion people live in absolute poverty, which is almost a fifth of the global population. But most, 70% of those people that live in absolute poverty live in middle-income countries. So they're not living in the least developed countries. And if we use a broader multidimensional measure that includes, say, lack of access to clean water, education, healthcare services that isn't just an income threshold, a full quarter of the global population is impoverished. So that was just meant to give you a bit of context of what poverty looks like today, both in the U.S. and globally. But let's think about this more conceptually for a moment. Is poverty natural in a market society? So no matter how much we develop, will we always have poor people? And maybe a related question to that is it the fault of poor people that they are poor? And it's clear that personal choice plays a factor, right? Some people choose to work more, some people choose to work less, but people also are offered different opportunities based on the endowments that they're born with, right? So, I think it's important to remember that individual choice is something that we can nudge, but we can't fix personal choice problems. And there's certainly an element of choice in poverty, but there's also a large environmental factor. So we should think about the systemic factors that we can provide policy remedies to, things like education funding, and other social support programs like Medicaid, right? So I think it's also important in this discussion to think about the relationship of income, money, to political power. And we live in a society, in the US anyway, where money confers a great deal of political power. And then that power can be easily used by the people with money to further enshrine that privileged position. And so that's also something to keep in mind, that the people that kind of win their way up the income ladder keep winning. And we'll talk about that in more detail in later classes. Now, I had you listen to the podcast that talked about many different ways of measuring poverty. And I think that I'm not going to go through each of those here, but something to keep in mind is that measuring of poverty is difficult. We've already talked about a few different ways in which it can be measured, using income thresholds or a multidimensional approach. But do we really need accurate measures of poverty to combat it? It's kind of one of those things that you can kind of apparently see. And in principle, maybe we don't, right? Maybe we just need to look at the interventions that have been effective in the past and implement those regardless of our ability to measure poverty. But I think it's also important to remember that in practice, we probably do need to actually measure these things, even if we don't need to measure them in principle. For one, we need to justify interventions if we decide to make them, right? And so it's a heck of a lot easier to justify further interventions if you've got some proof of efficacy, and that requires measurement. It also is important to keep in mind that if we have better ways of measuring poverty, perhaps a multidimensional approach that looks at specific goods and services people lack access to, it allows us to target interventions where they may be most effective. And so measurement is important, but it also, lack of perfect measures probably shouldn't be the thing that stops societies from intervening. Now, pivoting from that, let's talk about why we might care about inequality. And I find that it's often difficult to separate the concepts of inequality and poverty. Because, yes, we care that people lack resources, but why do we care that people have different amounts of resources? And for one, it contributes to undermining social solidarity. So less equal societies tend to be less politically stable. There are also growth implications. So empirically, we can look and we can see that nations that are highly unequal appear to grow more slowly. And finally, just like we kind of had two classes of motivations for poverty, we also have the idea of fairness. So this would be, there isn't some consequence we're afraid of, but we would maybe suppose that inequality is wrong on the face of it. It's unfair, and that might be bad. So an argument that you'll often hear in favor of inequality is that it may be good because it allows people to be rewarded based upon their contributions to the social product, to kind of what they produce. However, I think it's important as economists that we know the limitations of our models, and that this only occurs, people essentially receiving incomes in accordance with their marginal product. It only occurs when markets are functioning perfectly, whenever they're perfectly competitive. So we see every day that many markets that we interact with are not anything close to perfectly competitive. Entities have market power, discrimination exists, and there are also externalities and imperfect information to consider. So markets are not the well-oiled machine that this assertion would kind of need them to be. And so, maybe stepping away from the theoretical world a bit, in the rhetoric of it, you often hear Well, rich people are paid, have more income because they're more productive. Or that if you give rich people money, then they'll invest it in the economy, and that trickles down to everyone else. And finally, even though this is empirically against what we observe empirically, maybe inequality promotes growth because it incentivizes people to be productive. And so we've got many reasons here to maybe be very concerned about inequality, and many reasons that people argue why we shouldn't be concerned about inequality. So, some equal society. So let's talk about some of the consequentialist measures that we can look at. So some equal societies tend to grow fast, and some unequal societies grow slow. There isn't an evidence for some sort of smooth, stable growth equality trade-off in the middle of the clump. But it appears that there's a lower and a higher threshold beyond which equality and inequality affect growth. So essentially, if you're kind of in the middle of the pack, there's not a lot of growth implications. But if you're highly unequal, you tend to grow a bit slower. And if you are very equal, you tend to grow faster. And so keep that in mind, that it's not this kind of smooth trade-off between equity and growth that some people sometimes talk about. There's kind of threshold points beyond which it matters. So highly unequal societies may be less productive because it creates social or political instability that's bad for growth, right? If people are protesting, businesses may be afraid to invest long-term. Also, highly unequal societies tend to have a larger portion of their economy made up of by investment rather than consumption. And investment is kind of the most unstable component of your classic consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, right? So these highly unequal societies may be more exposed to financial crisis just due to this higher proportion of their economy that's made up by investment. So they also may be more vulnerable to these kind of crises because people further down the income distribution may resort to debt to support a living standard that they can't afford. And so it kind of makes the economy rest upon these kind of rickety foundations, which is something that we saw in the U.S. in the 2008 housing crisis. Highly polarized groups mix less, and which causes reduced intergenerational mobility and possibly less innovation. So researchers have discovered this empirically, that people are more and more tending to marry within their own social class rather than above and below. And so that helps, that contributes to preventing intergenerational mobility, as like, you know, a poor person marries a rich person, their children are more likely to be rich, right? And that just doesn't happen as much as it did in the past. And furthermore, if the vast majority of the population has very low income, then businesses may be afraid to invest because they expect future profits to be low in the future because there just aren't as many customers. So, something to keep in mind. As far as ways we measure it, I talked about this briefly in the measurement class. I wanted to go into a little more detail here. This is the Lorenz curve. So the idea is that you're kind of lining up every household in a country from left to right, where leftmost household is the poorest, rightmost is the richest, and you add up incomes of all these households as you move across. So by the end, you'll be at 100% of the nation's income because you've added up all of the household incomes, and that'll be the height of the graph at the end there. If everybody's household is kind of contributing the same amount to income, there's perfect equality, then you'll arrive at that 45-degree line. And no society is there, obviously. And so to calculate the Gini coefficient, we take the area A and we divide it by the area A plus B. And that provides us a Gini coefficient. Empirically, Gini coefficients range from about 0.2 at the most unequal to about 0.75 for the most equal. European nations range from about 0.2 to 0.3, largely a result of redistribution. So they tend to be more unequal than, say, for example, the US before taxes, but after taxes and redistribution, they become more equal. Take into account transfer of payments. Anything above 0.5, I reversed the order in the Gini ranges, but so anything above 0.5 is considered very unequal. This is common in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And 0.35 is kind of the dividing line between relatively equal and relatively unequal. And the current US Gini is about 0.41, so we're falling slightly on the unequal side of that line. There are some other ways of measuring inequality. One is the Palma ratio, which just takes the ratio of the income between the top 10% and the bottom 40% of the income distribution. So essentially, the income of the 10% of the population that's richest over the income of the bottom 40%. We can also look at income quantiles directly, the top or bottom 1, 5, or 10% income share. And finally, as I mentioned before, we can look at it in a more class or functional basis by looking at the labor share and the capital share. It's also possible to calculate a Gini coefficient globally. And if we look at that, we can see that global income inequality has mostly increased but declined slightly in the most recent decades with development in China. So these are all talking about income. Keep in mind that wealth, so accumulated income, wealth inequality is generally far more severe than income inequality. But it's also far more difficult to get data on wealth inequality. Because incomes have to be claimed annually for tax reasons, wealth just kind of sits there. So it's a lot more difficult to get specific data on it. Now, talking about how inequality changes over time, or more specifically, how inequality changes as a country develops. There's this idea called the Kuznets curve. And the idea is that whenever a country first starts to economically develop, it suffers increased inequality. And eventually, as it continues to develop, inequality declines. So the idea here is that early on, you've got a bunch of very poor subsistence farmers and a growing group of relatively better off urban laborers and capitalists. So as more and more of this kind of farm subsistence society is absorbed into market relations, inequality eventually declines. And this relationship seemed really robust and seemed to hold nicely until the 70s or about the 80s for the developed nations, so looking in retrospect. But after the 1980s, inequality actually started to increase in the developed nations. And this coincided with neoliberalism, right? So this reflects the fact that this kind of Kuznets curve relationship isn't some automatic mechanism, but the result of policy interventions. So here is a diagram just illustrating the Kuznets curve. We can think about it in a way kind of like inequality over time because per capita incomes tend to rise over development. So here, the vertical axis is income inequality, horizontal axis is per capita income, and so as per capita income increases, we see the initial increase in inequality and then eventually the decline. But, as previously mentioned, this relationship broke down in the 70s and 80s. So, and this breakdown was because inequality seemed to be increasing in the richest nations. And so, the next evolution in the idea was to think about Kuznets waves. And so the idea here is that in the pre-industrial period, there's not much we can say. During the first technological revolution of early development, we see the normal Kuznets curve, and then increasing inequality going into a second technological revolution. It's very important to note here that the idea of inequality declining afterwards is purely speculative at this point because we haven't observed this happening in any of the developed nations. And just like the first Kuznets curve, it's not if there is a downturn, it won't be the result of some inevitable mechanism. It will be the result of policy intervention. So, wrapping things up, poverty can be thought of as more than a simple lack of income. Poverty and inequality can be measured in several ways. We should think about the ways we measure them and what we're trying to get at. So if we're looking at a developed country, some measure of poverty that's maybe more grounded in relative poverty might be more important than an absolute poverty measure. The association between inequality and development is unclear, though it seems to have negative effects when it's particularly high. And finally, we should critically think about why we care about poverty and inequality, while not losing sight of what's actually going on in the real world. So that's all I've got for this one. But I think it's worth kind of thinking back and really trying to split apart the ideas of poverty and inequality and thinking about why we care about each of them individually rather than lumping them together. Well, all right, and thanks.